So, this is the Spyderco South Fork Phil Wilson collaboration. What can be said about it? Well, it's S90V. It's grounded in one of their Taichung facilities. The fit and finish seems very nice, flushness all along here. You can barely detect the transition, and the pins also essentially seem flush. It does seem like they're slightly proud, probably because of the polishing process used on this handle, which is G10, and I hope it's G10. I'm not misstating that. I'll check and annotate that back in if I'm incorrect. As typical with their Taichung knives, the level of quality is quite high, but all the edges remain sharp. So the edge of the hole is sharp, down here is sharp, the spine is sharp. The spine actually came so sharp that if you had done that as new, you would have just sliced your finger open. I actually had to dull it before I could even test it. I usually like to test knives sort of stock first and then continue messing with them, but the same way down here, it was not really usable like that in stock form. If you tried to go up and use this, it was an actual hazard. And so I broke the edge slightly, and I'll go back more and do it. As far as grips, now it seems like the knife was intended with 3 different grips. Up here, like this, and then you can come back like here. And the latter 2 are just fine. The issue is when you come up here, and there are several issues. One issue is that this choil is insufficiently deep right here. So when you grab this, if you have sausage fingers like I do, your hand squishes up onto the edge, and it's not particularly safe. The other issue, aside from these being sharp, is that this point here on the plunge line is also quite sharp and pointy, and it's not very comfortable on your finger. And if you go for a pinch grip or something like that, this G10 is beautifully rounded, but that, again, it's sharp, and it gets you, and so it's not terribly comfortable in that grip, I find. Simply doesn't seem to have been made for it. But back here, it's very comfortable. I will note it is slick, so if you get your hands covered in something, it is not a high retention knife. It does clean very easily, though, which is, at least I'm guessing, why that was done that way. It doesn't really absorb liquids the way a canvas micarta would, so it's nice, easy to clean, and it's not a combat knife. Now this sort of gets into philosophy of use, and my major gripe with this knife, aside from, you make, what is this knife? It retails something like $225. I think the MSRP is over $300. Okay, it is S90V, but it's, how much extra would it have taken to break these edges down? I don't know. I think that could have been done. The other thing is that it's actually not ground very thin. Phil Wilson made a name for himself grinding knives from very thin steel stock, from high-grade, high-performance, high-carbide volume steels, and grinding them very thin behind the apex, and this knife simply isn't. In fact, this knife has the same thickness behind the apex as one of Spyderco's combat knives or tactical knives, such as the Military 2. It's about 0.7 millimeters. Again, I'll put the actual measurements down in the description below. Please check it. But, what does that take away from this knife? Well, it's simply not as effective a slicer as such. And so, you reach this sort of question, is this a Phil Wilson? Does it count? And I would argue no, because comparatively, you can look at a kitchen knife, which is ground quite thin, or you can look at this scrapyard knife done in Elmax. This is 0.3 millimeters behind the apex. I mean, that's, I don't know how visible it'll be, but that's miles different, and the cutting performance of this is significantly higher, despite slightly lower carbide load. And also, this knife, for what it's worth, cost $80, $90, something like that. I think they're still available on the secondary market for that sort of price, whereas this knife is $300. So are you really getting your value's worth out of it? Is it really a Phil Wilson? Well, I'm still not entirely convinced that it's worth it. It is nice to have the S90V. That's a real buzzword as far as sales go, but performance-wise, I feel that it's not what it could have been. And the other thing is the steel stock is quite thick. I mean, you look at this. It's almost as thick as a Paramilitary 2. And I guess, if the complaint is that, well, it's S90V and a lot of grinding would be necessary and it's expensive grinding to do, I would have simply thinned down the steel stock so you could get that much thinner at the apex, because with this design, which is a Skinner and fillet sort of design, you really don't need that extra blade strength. Now, what it does do, to an extent, is put this into a sort of more survival class knife, because now all of a sudden you have specifications where you have a knife that is much more broadly applicable. Is this really the blade, handle design, etc. that you'd want for such a knife? Probably not. The tip is relatively delicate. The steel is relatively low toughness. So you could squeeze it into that role, but you'd be forfeiting a number of things that are considered common techniques, such as anything other than relatively light batoning and stuff like that. You can cut into things and twist out, though. So, I've heard the counter-argument, and you will hear the counter-argument saying, well, this is a production manufacturer, so they really can't grind a knife as thin because they'll be getting warranty claims. Well, so if we look at the Spyderco finish-inspired designs, clearly that was not an issue. They are perfectly willing to grind knives extremely thin when it suits them. Additionally, we can look at this, Scrapyard, and if you were to look at Scrapyard versus Spyderco, which company would you expect to have more issues with warranty claims because of thin ground knives? The company that says, we don't warranty any sort of abuse and anything other than light cutting might constitute abuse, or the company that says, why don't you just beat the piss out of everything and get drunk? So I'm not sure I really buy that argument. So I'm not sure why Spyderco felt the need to make the knife as thick as it is. It doesn't completely ruin it, per se, but it is a little disappointing. And in future, grinding this whole thing thinner is likely on my agenda, because it will make it a much better performing knife, and it can take it. As far as edge retention, did a little initial edge retention. S90V is sort of a known quantity. Spyderco heat treat doesn't initially seem to have any major issues with it. The original edge, and I should stress, I got this knife technically used. I'm second owner, but it was said to be new in box, pre-owned. So the original edge, it hadn't been over buffed, but the grinder that had been used, the company had jumped from a very coarse belt straight onto the buffer. So where it was sharp, it was quite sharp, but there were chips out of the edge from where the buffer, from where the grinder was too aggressive, and the buffer was simply unable to take those out. So you could shave with it quite readily, but if you tried to do something like cut paper to test the edge, you'd find little hang-ups in it, which you could also detect with your nail. Resharpening was no issue, but then again, I use diamond stone, so I tend to complain less about sharpening knives. I also try, unlike Cliff, to cut fewer rocks, so not as much sharpening is required. There's not much else to say about this knife. It's a very beautifully ground, beautifully made knife. It's just a shame it's not finer behind the edge and just a little thinner overall. And that's my disappointment. I already showed the competitive option here. Another quasi-competitive option I'll throw out simply for the purposes of being crass is the Richmond Artifacts in M390. And this is something else I sort of want to get into slightly, which is the cost. So we have composite handles, pinned, ground, what have you. Okay, this was ground more, granted. And steel grinding. M390 is not hugely cheap, nor is it hugely easy to grind compared to S90V. Both are relatively high carbon, high carbide volume, etc. knives. Spyderco is slightly thicker, But clearly, if you were to look at these two knives, significantly more grinding was necessary on the Artifex. So why the Artifex costs $100 and this costs $3 on the market? Okay, fine. Why is this double the price of this? It's certainly not double anything else. Little questions there. God, the mosquitoes. You'd think this time of year they'd have just given up. So that's my point on that. And it's even a shame, just one more competitive option to pull out. The Scale Bradley, also made in the Taichung facility, it's also slightly thinner behind the apex everywhere except until you get up at the tip. And yes, this is CPM M4, and yes, it is hollow ground. But again, just a sort of question, why does this knife cost what it does, and does it really deliver adequate performance? And I'm afraid I must say I'm not entirely convinced of that. If you just have to have S9DV, yeah, this is a way you can get it, but it is what it is. I will also note that the Bento Box Shop Sprint Run in S9DV, the Military, also this has no moving parts, which makes it a little bit absurd how much it costs. But the S9DV Military Bento Box Shop is only street price $60 or so more, and people are screaming that they're scalping on that. So how this ended up at this price point, I'm not sure. Maybe it's just extreme low volume from Spyderco's perspective because fixed blades are not as popular as their folders. I honestly don't know, but those are sort of my thoughts on the knife. I hope they help. It's not really a Phil Wilson. If you like Phil Wilson's other knives, this will not be in the same class. It is more readily available. I don't really want to comment on price because Phil Wilson doesn't really state prices, I believe, but it's not as cheap and it's not as high performance as we would have all hoped it would be. Still a nice knife. Whether or not it's worth it to you, though, is a little questionable. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope this was informative.